And thanks everyone for the discussion so far. My name is Leslie McGorrigan. I work at Leeds University and I'm also a member of the National Executive Committee of UCU. So we've got 3 speakers in this second part of the session. I'll do like Margot did. At about 5 minutes, I'll raise my sign. You'll also probably hear my timer go off. I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker in this session, Hannah Jones, who's co-chair of Warwick UCU.
Thank you, and thanks to the organisers for putting this event together and inviting me to speak on behalf of the branch. I'm currently co-chairing Warwick University UCU, and I'm speaking today following the events that Goldie mentioned last week. The Education Select Committee was held on Tuesday, and Jonathan Gullis MP named some of our branch members and then used parliamentary privilege to explicitly call for them to be sacked. Neither the chair of the Select Committee nor the Minister for the Universities pointed out to him that in doing so, he was crossing a line in terms of democracy and interference in academic life. MPs at the committee went so far as to claim that the university was hiding behind both academic freedom and employment law in not having already summarily dismissed our colleagues. And this was in relation to the case that Goldie described to you earlier, in which had been investigated and so on, and found to be unproblematic. So you've heard about some of this from Goldie as one of the people named, and if you want to read our branch's full statement on what happened, you can go to our Twitter account, which is at Warwick UCU on Twitter. We put out a statement last week, which some of you will have seen. It's important to recognise that Gullis and other MPs at the Education Select Committee were calling for interference in academic institutions, and they were claiming to do so in order to protect Jewish students using the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. But the claims of Gullis to care about Jewish students are belied by his previous attempts to interfere in academic research, where he's used anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories to try and call off funding for research into colonial histories. Gullis was one of the so-called common sense group of MPs who signed an open letter calling on the Culture Secretary to withdraw funding from research into colonial histories of National Trust properties, claiming such research represented cultural Marxist dogma. So he tried to stifle anti-racist research then using anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and then a couple of months later claims to be protecting Jewish students by calling for the dismissal of other anti-racist academics. It's really worth noting that those making IHRA working definition-based complaints about research and teaching in universities usually cite Jewish student concerns, and people have mentioned this kind of move. But there seems to be a lot less attention paid to the welfare and concerns of Jewish staff, and of course, Jewish students and Jewish staff don't all think the same thing. But we're constantly told that it feels like that's what we're being told. At Warwick, Jewish staff wrote to the VC to express concerns about problems with the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism last year, and to ask for a different approach to countering anti-Semitism and all racism. And this was disregarded. The way that the supposed concerns for tackling anti-Semitism is being manipulated by the government and others is incredibly upsetting. At the same Education Select Committee, the chair of the committee, Robert Halfon MP, repeatedly suggested that universities in the UK in the 2020s are comparable to 1930s Germany. My grandfather fled Nuremberg in 1930s Germany as a child, so as not to be murdered in a death camp. To suggest that these are similar is appalling. And I've lost my place. And in fact, it's astounding to make that comparison. So I think it's really important that we recognise that the attacks on university life from this government are many, varied and linked, and they're fundamentally anti-democratic and also fraudulent. Gavin Williamson has chosen to make the adoption of the IHRA definition a defining feature of his attack on HE, but we must refuse this as the singular ground on which to fight. I agree that we must fight it, but as Goldie said, it's important to make these links. It's clear the IHRA definition is not fit for purpose in protecting anyone from discrimination, and it's part of a wider anti-democratic culture war, which includes MPs and ministers' threats of interference in funding historical work on colonial pasts with the Colonial Countrysides Project, proposed 50% funding cuts to subjects in arts and humanities in the consultation from the Office for Students, which closes tonight if you've not responded to it already, Government interference in appointments to boards of public bodies, as with the refusal to allow Aminul Haq to continue to serve on the board of the Maritime Museum, which made it to the papers this week. The DfE guidance on teaching about anti-capitalism in schools being a problem, and the attack by Kemi Badenoch as Equalities Minister on the teaching of critical race theory, which was during a parliamentary discussion of Black Lives Matter, and which was later voted Speech of the Year for 2020 by Conservative Home Readers. So the IHRA working definition is the grounds that have been chosen singularly for this fight by Gavin Williamson and colleagues. And the left needs to make clear this is one part of a wider pattern of racist and anti-democratic interventions by government, and we must link this to renewed anti-racist praxis. We should also think about making the links with international comrades where similar kind of attacks have been made, not necessarily where questions about criticism of Israel have been centered in places that are much further down this road, like Turkey, Brazil, Hungary, and India.
Sorry about that noise. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. I'll now introduce David Johnson. He's a professor at the Open University, and he's a Senate member who took the motion there that led to the Open University adopting the JDA definition. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. In my 5 minutes, I think the most useful thing I can do is just tell you about what happened at the OU and hope that it has lessons for other universities. I'm conscious that all universities have very different structures, so not everything that we manage to do might, some of it might not be possible elsewhere. Very briefly, the university has a Senate and a council. The Senate has 120 elected members, and the Senate advises council on what to do. And there was a motion before Senate to adopt the IHRA definition in January. In the January meeting, there was a counter motion proposed saying people need to inform themselves. We need some time to understand the issues. I think it's really important to always remember that these arguments have to go out to lots of people at the universities who really aren't that interested in these debates in the way we are. So that was accepted, and we had 3 months to organize. In the 3 months between January and April, lots of things happened. A forum was hosted at the university on the university website where people had frequently asked questions, and answers were posted about the IHRA definition. There was an open thread forum where people posted their points of view. That wasn't taken up because it quickly became very aggressive and combative. But crucially, what also happened on the 25th of March was the JDA definition was published. And we had to make a decision really whether to let the next Senate meeting vote on adopting the IHRA definition that was being pushed through by the Vice Chancellor's executive through its Education Committee and take a risk on a vote there. There was every likelihood that people not being very well informed, we would have lost that vote and it would have been adopted. So what we decided to do, a small group of us, was to suggest an amendment that both the JDA and the IHRA definition be adopted, because our conviction was that the JDA definition would neutralize the effects of the IHRA definition. So that argument was put to our council in April, to our Senate in April. And the arguments we made were ones that have been brilliantly made by some of the earlier speakers. The JDA is superior in that it had 200 signatories, highly respected scholars. The IHRA definition was written by Kenneth Stern, who had completely disavowed it. In terms of the two definitions, the JDA provides a very short, precise definition, as Ken Loach has recognized in his earlier contribution. The IHRA definition is notoriously vague and unhelpful. And crucially, the third thing, the examples in the JDA are very precise, distinguishing between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The examples in the IHRA are profoundly controversial and unhelpful. So that went to the vote, and what happened was that both the amendment went through by a very large majority, 70% in favor, 10% abstentions, and only 20% voted against it. So what we've ended up with at the Open University is both definitions have been endorsed, and they both are subordinate to the university's commitment to academic freedom and the Equality Act. So that is the fundamental starting point, but that these two, the IHRA and JDA, can both be consulted in cases of anti-Semitism. And as I suppose, you know, I took this as, and you know, we took this as a victory, because this did it, you know, just very briefly on a personal level. I teach literature, teach post-colonial literature. Post-colonial literature wouldn't exist without Edward Said, advocate of Palestinian rights. Every day of his life, Edward Said was accused of anti-Semitism. So the fear was, for me, was that we teach Primo Levi. Will we be able to teach Ghassan Ghanafani and other wonderful Palestinian writers? Had we only had the IHRA definition, that chilling effect Kenneth Stern talks about would have made it very hard to teach Palestinian literature. With both the definitions in place, I'm very, very confident that we'll be able to teach Palestinian literature as we can choose to teach whatever other literature we want to do. So just really, I think, you know, the JDA definition isn't perfect. There are things, you know, all of us might have done differently. We might have framed it differently, but we have to think in terms of our broader constituency and the pragmatics of where we go next. So the kind of I was trying to think of the 5 takeaway points. The first thing is to persuade people to read the JDA. There are lots of people who don't know about it. Appeal to people's hostility to racism and anti-Semitism. Everybody signs up for that. Everybody signs up for a passion for freedom of speech. And the other arguments is that, yeah, there's a legal nightmare that follows for universities if they only have the IHRA, whereas if they have both definitions, they produce a compromise that doesn't inhibit, I believe, doesn't inhibit us in the way that, you know, it represents a solution. Sorry there, Leslie. I tried really hard to stop talking.
That was great. Thank you very much, David. Okay, so our final speaker in this session is Anne Alexander. Anne works at the University of Cambridge, and she's the editor of Middle East Solidarity magazine.
Thanks very much, Leslie, and thank you to everyone for the opportunity to speak at this really important meeting. I should say that in addition to being a UCU activist at the University of Cambridge, I actually have a PhD in Middle Eastern history and began my academic career working on the anti-colonial movements in Egypt and Iraq in the 1940s and 1950s. Of course, the issue of Palestine runs through that very much. And I wonder if I had been starting my research as a PhD student today, whether the kind of chilling effect that other speakers have spoken about so eloquently would have had an effect on me. Other people have covered in detail some of the scale of the scope of the attack we're facing. So I really want to focus on what we can do collectively to resist this, and why, although multiple channels and venues for this fight are going to be extremely important, it matters in particular that UCU continues its long-standing tradition of opposition on principle to the IHRA working definition, and that we work through the union as well as other efforts that we may be engaged in. I think the first thing that's important, I'm saying this from the point of view of somebody who comes from Middle East studies background, is that we actually have to carry on critical teaching research on the history, politics and culture of Palestine to talk about Zionism, of Israel and the wider Middle East. And that this actually will require collective organisation. In particular, we need to make sure that there are support networks and concrete forms of solidarity, both moral, political and financial, in place to ensure that those who are most vulnerable who work in this area know they can count on the union's support and the support of their colleagues, both at branch level and national level, to keep on with this work, particularly graduate students, early career researchers, colleagues in casualised roles, and anyone who's facing other forms of structural discrimination and oppression because of their race, gender or nationality, for example, needs to know that we will push back collectively with them to keep open this space for critical inquiry, debate and analysis. So in concrete terms, that means finding out if there is a graduate student, for example, running a seminar in your department or in another department in the university on the settler colonial origins of the Israeli state, and making sure that they know that if there is any interference by management in the title or the contents, or if they are worried about vexatious complaints from students or others based on the interpretation of the examples in this deeply flawed and discredited definition, that will be challenged, and that our right to teach and research this history will be defended. In practical terms, that means, for example, making sure that there's support networks for colleagues such as Goldie and others who face these kind of complaints. And it means making sure that in our UCU branches, that members are educated about this, that it's discussed in branch meetings, that we are organising public campaigns that make sure that everybody in the university is aware of what is going on and what our position is. You might say, in a context where humanities and arts as a whole are facing an onslaught of devastating cuts, which are designed to turn many of these disciplines into a minority pastime for a small number of students at elite institutions like mine, you might say, what hope do we have to making a case, taking on a battle over this rather specialist subject? But again, as other colleagues have said, this is really a battle about over the very idea of what a university is. So we have to build these alliances across disciplines, across universities and institutions, because this has to be based on a perspective that if the government is allowed to police what can and can't be taught and researched on this question, and in this case working closely with external pressure groups, that's a threat to everyone who cares about defending universities as places for learning and critical thinking. So again, that means mapping out in each institution a route to delegitimise and challenge the covert adoption of the IHRA definition by fiat through unelected committees. I thought Miriam made a very good point in her contribution about how we need more meetings, we need more public events. We need to find members of the senates and university councils and academic boards like David, who just spoke, who will stand up and call for the retraction of the IHRA definition. That has to be the first point that we're trying to push for. We want the IHRA definition to be retracted, like at UCL, backed up by open letters and mobilisation of staff and students around the call for a debate on the question has happened in UCL. If we cannot win retraction, then I think that the Jerusalem Declaration can be proposed as an alternative, because it undermines the IHRA definition's claim somehow this document is the sole voice of the Jewish community. These are tactical decisions and they have to be taken on an institution by institution basis, and they should not in any way undermine our parallel activity and work or organising in solidarity for Palestine. The final thing that I want to emphasise here is that we have to get organised around this question within UCU. As colleagues have already mentioned, there'll be resolutions at Congress in a few weeks' time calling on the union to organise a national campaign over this issue. And so if you're a UCU member, you can contact your branch delegation and urge them to vote for those motions. It's a real sign of the need for a campaign that a meeting on this scale has come together across the union without actually input so far from the union's national resources. That has to change. We need an active network across different branches and regions to share information, pool resources, to help each other find speakers and mobilise solidarity when colleagues such as Goldie and other colleagues at Warwick and in other institutions come under attack. We need your help to do this, and I'm sure that we can organise this together.